The storm hit Blue Creek without warning, and Nora Everly was halfway across the open ground between the newspaper office and the Mercantile when the first gust nearly knocked her sideways. Snow swirled thick and blinding, turning the familiar street into a white maze. She clutched her coat tighter, papers tucked against her ribs, and stumbled toward the nearest shelter, a squat wooden storage shed at the edge of the freight yard. The door gave under her weight, and she fell inside, gasping, shaking snow from her hair. Then she looked up and saw him. Hollis Cutter stood at the back of the shed, hands at his sides, eyes steady and dark in the dim light. The man half the territory said was dangerous. The man she'd been writing about for 3 weeks. He didn't move. Neither did she. The wind howled outside, rattling the shed walls. Nora's heart hammered, not just from the cold. She'd seen his name on the warrant posted at the sheriff's office. Theft of freight goods. Suspected involvement in a land fraud scheme. The law wanted him questioned, and rumors said he'd already run once. But standing there, looking at her with that calm, unreadable expression, he didn't look like a man who ran. He looked like a man who waited. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. His voice was rougher than she'd expected, but not cruel. "The storm will pass in an hour. You can leave then." Nora swallowed. She should leave now, storm or not. But the wind screamed, and she could barely see 3 feet beyond the door. She stepped back, letting the door swing shut, and the shed fell into near darkness. Just thin cracks of gray light between the boards. She pressed her back against the wall, still clutching the papers. They were the reason she'd been running across town in the first place. Shipping manifests, land deed copies, names and dates that didn't match. Evidence that someone in Blue Creek was stealing land out from under homesteaders. And the freight company was part of it. She'd found the papers in a stack of old office records her father had left behind, back when he still spoke to her. Back before he called her a fool for taking over the newspaper and told her she'd never be worth the ink she wasted. Hollis shifted, and Nora flinched. He stopped. "You're the newspaper woman," he said. "Nora Everly." She nodded, then realized he might not see it. "Yes, I've read your pieces." He moved slowly, pulling a crate forward and sitting down, giving her space. "You write like you're not afraid to ask questions." "I'm not," she said, though her voice came out thinner than she wanted. "Are you?" "Afraid, I mean." He was quiet for a moment. The wind filled the silence. "Then," he said, "I'm afraid of a lot of things. Just not the ones people think." That wasn't the answer she'd expected. Nora's fingers loosened slightly on the papers. "The warrant," she said carefully. "Is it true?" Hollis looked at her. Really looked. And she felt the weight of it. "The warrant says I stole freight. I didn't. But someone did. And they made sure my name was on the paperwork. I've been trying to prove it for a month. The law doesn't much care what I have to say. Why not? Because the man who signed that warrant owns half the freight contracts in the territory, and he's got the sheriff in his pocket." Hollis's voice stayed even, but something hard edged into it. "If I go to jail, the foreclosure on Juniper Ranch goes through without a fight. 40 families lose their land, and nobody asks why." Nora's breath caught. Juniper Ranch. She'd written about the foreclosure notice last week, a brief piece because she hadn't understood the full picture. But now, standing in a shed with a man the law called a thief, she started to see the shape of something bigger. The papers against her ribs suddenly felt heavier. Who signed the foreclosure? Man named Voss, Hollis said. Runs the land office. Also happens to own the freight company I work for. Worked for. Nora closed her eyes. Voss. The same name on 3 of the manifests she'd found. The same name on a deed transfer dated 2 weeks before a family had been evicted from a homestead they'd paid for in full. She opened her eyes and looked at Hollis. I think I have something you need to see. She pulled the papers out slowly, unfolding them in the dim light. Hollis stood and stepped closer, careful, and Nora's pulse jumped at the proximity. He smelled like cold air and wood smoke and leather. She held the papers where a sliver of light fell across them. Shipping records, she said. Deed copies, all tied to Voss. All showing goods and land moving under false names. If this is real, he's been running a fraud scheme for at least 2 years. Hollis stared at the papers, then at her. Where did you get these? My father's old office files. He was a surveyor before we stopped speaking. I think he knew something was wrong, but he never said. She hesitated. I didn't know what to do with them. I was going to run a story, but I don't have enough proof. Just names and numbers that don't add up. Hollis reached out slowly, and Nora let him take the papers. He scanned them, his jaw tightening. This is it. This is what I've been looking for. If we can tie these manifests to the foreclosure documents, we can prove Voss is stealing land and blaming the thefts on freight workers to cover his tracks. We? Nora said. Hollis looked up, and for the first time, she saw something other than wariness in his eyes. Hope, maybe. Or desperation. I can't do this alone. The law won't listen to me. But they might listen to you. You've got the newspaper. You've got a voice. I've got a newspaper nobody in power respects, Nora said bitterly. My father made sure of that. He told everyone I was too soft, too naive, too much like my mother. She swallowed the old ache. Nobody takes me seriously. Maybe they will now, Hollis said quietly. If you give them a reason. The wind eased slightly, and the silence between them grew less sharp. Nora studied him. She'd spent 3 weeks writing carefully neutral reports about the warrant, about the freight company troubles, never naming him directly, but never defending him either. She'd been safe. She'd been a coward. And now here he was, holding stolen papers she should have turned over to the law, asking her to risk everything. You don't even know me, she said. No, Hollis agreed. But I know what it's like to be called something you're not. And I know what it's like to try and prove you're better than the worst thing anyone ever said about you. He handed the papers back. If you don't want to help, I understand. But if you do, we don't have much time. The foreclosure hearing is in 5 days. Nora took the papers, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through her. She pulled back, folding the papers carefully. 5 days, she repeated. 5 days, Hollis said. And a whole town that wants to see me hang. The storm broke an hour later, and Nora left the shed without another word. But she didn't go home. She went back to the newspaper office, lit every lamp, and started writing. By dawn, she had a draft that named Voss, cited the manifests, and called for an independent audit of the land office. It was the most dangerous thing she'd ever written. It was also the truest. She set the type herself, her hands shaking, and printed 200 copies. Then she walked through Blue Creek in the early light, sliding papers under doors, tacking them to posts, leaving stacks at the mercantile and the church steps. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, half the town had read it. By noon, the sheriff was at her door. "Miss Everly," Sheriff Pruitt said, his voice hard. "You've made some serious accusations." Nora stood in the doorway of the newspaper office. "Chin up." "I printed the truth." "You printed speculation," Pruitt said. "And you've put yourself in a bad position. Voss is filing a libel suit. He wants your press seized and your office shut down." Nora's stomach dropped, but she didn't step back. "Then let him file. I have documentation." "Do you?" Pruitt's eyes narrowed. "Or do you have papers that could have come from anywhere? Papers that a wanted man might have given you?" She said nothing. Pruitt leaned closer. "Hollis Cutter is a thief, Miss Everly. If you're protecting him, you're breaking the law." "If he's a thief," Nora said evenly, "then prove it. Bring the evidence. Show the town. But you won't, because there isn't any. There's just Voss's word, and a warrant you signed without asking questions." Pruitt's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Then explain it to me," Nora said. "Explain why 40 families are losing their land to a man who's been falsifying freight records for 2 years. Explain why Hollis Cutter's name is on a warrant, but not on a single piece of actual evidence." Pruitt stepped back, his hand on his belt. "You've got until tomorrow to retract that story. If you don't, I'll shut you down myself." He turned and walked away, boots heavy on the boardwalk. Nora closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She'd just made an enemy of the law. But she'd also made a promise, even if she hadn't said it out loud. She couldn't stop now. She pulled on her coat and headed for the freight yard. If Hollis was still there, they needed to talk. If he'd run, she was on her own. She wasn't sure which possibility scared her more. She found him at the edge of the yard, loading a wagon. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression shifted. "Saw your paper," he said. Nora stopped a few feet away. "The sheriff wants me to retract it. Will you?" "No." She met his eyes. "But I need more than manifests. I need witnesses. I need proof that ties Voss directly to the fraud. Do you have anything?" Hollis set down the crate he'd been holding. "There's a man," he said slowly. "Name's Farrow. He used to work the land office, kept the books. He quit 3 months ago, right after Voss started pushing the foreclosures. He might talk, if we can find him." "Where is he?" Hollis hesitated. "Last I heard, he was staying at a line shack up near Juniper Ranch. It's a hard ride, maybe 4 hours in good weather. Then we leave now," Nora said. Hollis stared at her. "You can't ride out there with me. If anyone sees us together, they'll say you're helping a fugitive." "They already think that," Nora said. "The sheriff as good as accused me this morning. And if I don't get that testimony, Voss wins. The foreclosure goes through, you go to jail, and I lose the press." She stepped closer. "I'm not asking permission, Mr. Cutter. I'm telling you I'm coming." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or respect. He nodded once. "Then we ride fast, and we stay quiet. If we're caught, I won't let them blame you. I'll take my own blame, Nora said. I'm not a child. They saddled 2 horses, and Nora changed into a split-riding skirt and heavier boots in the office, her hands quick and sure despite the nerves twisting in her chest. She wasn't used to this. The physical risk, the breaking of rules. Her father had always said she was too soft for frontier life, too much like her mother, who died when Nora was 8. He'd wanted a son, someone who could handle the rough edges of the West. Instead, he'd gotten a daughter who loved words more than guns. And eventually, he'd stopped trying to make her into something she wasn't. He'd just stopped trying at all. They rode north out of Blue Creek, staying off the main road, cutting through open country where the wind bit cold and the sky stretched pale and endless. Hollis rode easy, like a man who'd spent half his life in the saddle. And Nora did her best to keep up. Her thighs ached after the first hour, but she didn't complain. They didn't talk much. The land said enough, rolling and spare, dotted with winter-brown grass and the occasional stand of juniper trees dark against the snow. Halfway to the ranch, Hollis pulled up suddenly, his hand raised. Nora stopped beside him. What? Riders, he said quietly. Coming from the east. Nora turned and saw them. 2 men on horseback, still distant, but closing. Her heart kicked. The sheriff? Don't know. Hollis scanned the terrain. There's a ravine a quarter-mile west. If we move now, we can lose them. They spurred the horses and rode hard, the cold air burning Nora's lungs. The ravine appeared suddenly, a sharp cut in the earth, and they dropped down into it, dismounting fast. Hollis pulled the horses into the shadow of an overhang and motioned for Nora to stay low. She crouched beside him, her shoulder pressed against his, both of them breathing hard. The riders passed overhead, their voices faint, and then faded into the distance. Hollis waited another full minute before he moved. That was close, Nora whispered. Too close, Hollis said. He looked at her, and she realized how near they were, close enough that she could see the scar along his jaw, the way his eyes weren't quite black, but a deep brown with flecks of gold. You all right? She nodded, but her hands were shaking. Hollis reached out slowly and steadied them with his own. His palms were rough, warm, and the touch sent a shock of awareness through her. She pulled back, flustered. I'm fine. He let her go, but his gaze held. You didn't have to come out here. Yes, I did, Nora said, because nobody else will. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but something had shifted between them. A thread of connection pulled tighter. By the time they reached the line shack, the sun was low and the temperature dropping fast. The shack was small and weathered, tucked against a stand of junipers, smoke rising thin from the chimney. Hollis dismounted and knocked. The door opened a crack, and a man's face appeared, old and wary. Pharaoh, Hollis said. I need to talk. The man's eyes flicked to Nora, then back. You brought the newspaper woman. That's either brave or stupid. Maybe both, Hollis said. But we need your help. Voss is pushing the foreclosure through, and if we don't stop him, Juniper Ranch is gone. Pharaoh was silent for a long moment. Then he stepped back and let them in. The shack was barely warmer than outside, just a small stove and a cot. But it felt like a reprieve. Pharaoh poured coffee from a battered pot and handed them tin cups. I knew someone would come eventually, he said. I just didn't think it'd be you, Cutter. I didn't have a choice, Hollis said. They pinned the thefts on me. Farrow nodded grimly. Voss needed a scapegoat. You were convenient. He sipped his coffee. I kept copies of the real books. The ones that show what he was doing. Land grabs, false deeds, freight theft blamed on workers, while he sold the goods himself. It's all there. Nora leaned forward. Will you testify? Farrow's face tightened. If I testify, Voss will come after me. He's got men who don't ask questions. If you don't, Nora said quietly, 40 families lose everything. And more will follow. Voss won't stop. Farrow closed his eyes. My wife's buried out here. I stayed because of her. But she wouldn't want me to hide while good people suffer. He opened his eyes. All right. I'll testify. But you get me to that hearing alive. And you make damn sure Voss doesn't walk away clean. Hollis nodded. You have my word. They stayed at the shack that night, because riding back in the dark was too dangerous. Farrow gave Nora the cot and rolled a blanket on the floor. Hollis stood watch by the door, his rifle across his knees. Nora lay awake, staring at the rough ceiling, listening to the wind and the crackle of the stove. She'd crossed a line today, and there was no going back. She'd thrown her lot in with a man the law called dangerous, and she dragged a frightened witness into the open. If this went wrong, she'd lose everything. But if it went right, maybe she'd finally prove she was more than her father's disappointment. Hollis's voice came soft through the darkness. You awake? Yes, Nora said. Thank you. For this. She turned her head toward him, though she could barely see his shape. You don't have to thank me. I'm doing what's right. Most people don't, Hollis said. Even when they know what that is. Nora was quiet for a moment. My father used to say I was too soft, that I'd never survive out here, because I cared too much about the wrong things. What are the wrong things? Hollis asked. Truth. Fairness. People. She swallowed. He wanted me to be hard, to stop asking questions and just accept that some people win and some people lose. But I couldn't. I can't. Then he was wrong, Hollis said. You're not too soft. You're just strong, in a way he didn't understand. Nora's throat tightened. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, the old wound her father had left didn't ache quite so much. They rode back to Blue Creek at first light, Farrow with them, his saddlebags full of ledgers and documents. The town was stirring when they arrived, and Nora saw the looks, the whispers. She rode straight to the newspaper office, Hollis and Farrow behind her, and she didn't look away from the stairs. Let them talk. She had work to do. Inside, she cleared the desk and spread out Farrow's documents. Hollis stood guard by the window, watching the street. Farrow walked her through the books, page by page, showing her the patterns, the false names, the money trails. It was even worse than she'd thought. Voss had stolen from at least 60 families over 2 years, and he'd covered it by blaming freight workers, migrants, and anyone else without power to fight back. This is enough, Nora said, her voice shaking with anger. This is more than enough. For the law, maybe, Farrow said. But Voss has friends. The judge at the foreclosure hearing is one of them. Then we go over his head, Nora said. We take this to the territorial governor. We make so much noise they can't ignore it. Hollis turned from the window. The hearing's tomorrow. We don't have time to get to the Capitol and back. Then, we go to the hearing with what we have, Nora said. And we make sure everyone in that room hears the truth. Hollis crossed to the desk. If we do that, Boss will know we have the books. He'll come after us before we ever get to the governor. Let him, Nora said. She looked at Hollis, then at Farrow. We've come this far. We can't stop now. That night, Nora wrote the longest piece of her career. She laid out everything. Every name. Every date. Every stolen acre. She set the type by lamplight. Her hands steady now. And printed 500 copies. At dawn, she and Hollis carried stacks to the church, to the schoolhouse, to the saloon. By the time the foreclosure hearing began at 10, every person in Blue Creek had read the story. The courtroom was packed. Nora sat in the front row, Hollis beside her, Farrow on his other side. Voss sat across the aisle with his lawyer, his face tight with fury. Judge Hackett entered, a heavy man with cold eyes, and called the room to order. This hearing will proceed quickly, Hackett said. The matter is simple. Juniper Ranch has failed to meet its mortgage obligations. Foreclosure is the legal remedy. Your Honor. Nora stood, her voice ringing clear. I have evidence that disputes that claim. Hackett's eyes narrowed. You're not a party to this case, Miss Everly. I'm a witness, Nora said. And I have documentation that proves Mr. Voss has been falsifying land records and mortgage payments for 2 years. She held up the ledgers. These books show systematic fraud. Juniper Ranch was never in default. The records were altered. The courtroom erupted. Hackett banged his gavel. Order! Miss Everly, you will sit down. No, Your Honor, Nora said. Not until you hear the truth. She turned to the crowd. Voss has stolen from 60 families. He's blamed innocent men like Hollis Cutter to cover his crimes. And he's used this court to do it. Voss shot to his feet. This is slander. That woman is in league with a wanted criminal. Then arrest me, Nora said, turning to face him. But first, explain these books. Explain why your signature is on 40 false deeds. Explain why freight manifests show goods you reported stolen were actually sold by your own company. Voss's face went white. Hackett banged the gavel again. Miss Everly, you are in contempt. Then hold me in contempt, Nora said. But I won't be silent while you help a thief destroy innocent families. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Hollis stood, his hand on Nora's arm, and she saw the warning in his eyes. But she didn't sit. Farrow stood too, his voice shaking but clear. I worked the land office for 12 years. I kept the real books. Everything she's saying is true. Voss threatened me to keep quiet. He said if I talked, I'd end up in an accident. The room fell silent. Hackett stared at Farrow, then at Voss, then at the ledgers Nora held. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. This hearing is postponed, Hackett said finally. I want a territorial marshal brought in to review these documents. Until then, all foreclosure proceedings are suspended. The courtroom exploded with voices. Voss shoved past his lawyer and stormed out. Nora sank into her seat, her legs suddenly weak. Hollis's hand stayed on her shoulder, steady and grounding. You did it, he said quietly. We did it, Nora said. She looked up at him, and the relief in his eyes was so raw, it made her chest ache. But they weren't finished. Voss was still free, and men like him didn't go quietly. That night, Nora worked late at the newspaper office, writing a follow-up story. Hollis stayed with her, sitting by the stove, cleaning his rifle. The lamplight flickered, and the office felt small and warm despite the cold outside. Nora's fingers cramped from typesetting, but she didn't stop. She wanted the story out by morning. One more nail in Voss's coffin. "You should go home," Hollis said. "Get some sleep." "I will," Nora said, not looking up. Soon, Hollis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why did you do it? Risk everything for people you don't even know?" Nora paused, her hands stilling on the type. "Because no one did it for my mother. She died in childbirth, and the doctor who could have saved her didn't come because we couldn't pay him up front. My father never forgave himself. Or me." She swallowed. "I can't bring her back, but I can make sure other people don't suffer because someone decided they weren't worth saving." Hollis stood and crossed to the desk. He stopped just beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "I'm sorry," he said. Nora looked up. "For what?" "For what your father did to you. For the years you spent trying to prove you were enough." His voice was rough. "You didn't need to prove anything. You already were." Tears pricked Nora's eyes. She blinked them back. "I don't know how to believe that." Hollis reached out and touched her cheek, just a brush of his fingers, so careful it made her breath catch. "Then let me show you," he said, and he kissed her. It was slow and searching, a question and an answer all at once. Nora's hands came up to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and she kissed him back, all the fear and hope and loneliness pouring into that single connection. When they finally pulled apart, Hollis rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have much to offer," he said quietly. "A freight wagon and a reputation I'm still trying to clear. But if you'll have me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice." Nora's throat was too tight to speak. She nodded, and Hollis smiled, rare and genuine, and kissed her again. The moment broke when the door slammed open. Nora jerked back, and Hollis spun, his hand going to his rifle. Sheriff Pruitt stood in the doorway, his face hard. "Step away from her, Cutter." Hollis didn't move. "What do you want, Pruitt?" "Voss filed an assault complaint. Says you threatened him outside the courthouse." Pruitt's hand rested on his gun. "I've got a warrant." "That's a lie," Nora said, stepping forward. "Hollis was with me all afternoon." Pruitt's eyes flicked to her. "Then you're lying too." "Step aside, Miss Everly. I'm taking him in." "No," Nora said. She moved between Hollis and the sheriff. "You're not taking him anywhere. Voss is trying to silence us before the marshal arrives. If you arrest Hollis now, you're part of the cover-up." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "I'm enforcing the law." "Then enforce it honestly," Nora said. "Wait for the marshal. Let him review the evidence. If Hollis is guilty, he'll face justice. But if you take him now, everyone will know you're in Voss's pocket." Pruitt stared at her. Then, he looked at Hollis. Then he stepped back. "You've got until the marshal gets here, Cutter. After that, if you run, I'll hunt you down myself." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Nora's knees nearly buckled. Hollis caught her arm. That was dangerous. "I know," Nora said. She looked at him. "But I'm tired of letting dangerous men get away with things, because I'm too afraid to stand in their way." Hollis pulled her close, and she let herself lean into him. Just for a moment, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his presence. "We're going to be all right," he said. "I promise." The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, a sharp-eyed man named Keller, who took the ledgers, questioned Faro, and arrested Voss within 6 hours. The charges were extensive: fraud, theft, forgery, conspiracy. The foreclosure on Juniper Ranch was voided, and an audit of the land office revealed dozens more falsified deeds. Voss's empire collapsed in a single afternoon. Nora wrote every word of it, and her newspaper sold more copies than it had in 5 years. People stopped her on the street, shook her hand, told her she'd done a brave thing. It felt strange. It felt good. Hollis's name was cleared, the warrant dismissed with an apology from the court. He went back to work, but not for a freight company. He started his own hauling business, small and honest, and within a month he had more contracts than he could handle. People trusted him. They trusted Nora too, and when she wrote about the need for a new land office overseer, the territorial governor appointed Faro. Justice, it turned out, could happen, just not easily. 3 weeks after the trial, Blue Creek held a town social to celebrate the start of spring. Nora hadn't planned to go. She had work, and besides, socials were for people who knew how to dance and laugh without second-guessing every word. But Hollis showed up at her door in a clean shirt and asked, and she didn't have the heart to say no. The social was held at the church hall, the big room strung with lanterns and filled with music and the smell of fresh bread. Nora felt out of place immediately, too aware of her plain dress, her ink-stained fingers, the way people still looked at her like she was something slightly scandalous. But Hollis took her hand and led her onto the floor, and when the music started, a simple waltz, he held her like she was something precious. "I'm not very good at this," Nora whispered. "Neither am I," Hollis said. "But we'll figure it out." They danced, awkward and earnest, and Nora found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Hollis smiled down at her, and the rest of the room faded. It was just them, two people who'd fought their way through fear and accusation and found each other on the other side. When the music ended, Hollis didn't let her go. He leaned close and said, "I know I already asked once, but I'm asking again. Will you have me, Nora? For good?" "Yes," Nora said, and it was the easiest word she'd ever spoken. They married a month later, a quiet ceremony at the church with Faro, and a handful of friends as witnesses. Nora wore her mother's lace, and Hollis wore his best shirt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Nora felt like she'd finally come home to something she hadn't known she was missing. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, close enough to the newspaper office that Nora could walk to work, far enough that they had space to breathe. Hollis built her a desk by the window, and Nora hung his freight schedule on the wall, and they made a life that was theirs. The newspaper thrived. Nora hired an assistant, a young man who wanted to learn the trade, and together they covered stories that mattered. Stories about people who needed a voice. She wrote about the homesteaders who'd gotten their land back, about the new school fund, about the farmers banding together to build a cooperative grain store. She wrote the truth, and people listened. One evening in late summer, Nora sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun go down over the prairie. Hollis came out and sat beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. "Long day?" he asked. "Good day," Nora said. She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. I got a letter from the governor's office. They want me to write a series on land reform for the territorial paper. Hollis kissed the top of her head. I'm not surprised. You're the best writer they've got. Nora smiled. I was thinking we could do a piece on Juniper Ranch. Show what happens when people fight for what's right. I think that's a fine idea, Hollis said. They sat in comfortable silence, the sky turning gold and pink, the prairie stretching wide and open before them. Nora thought about her father, about the years she'd spent trying to be someone he could respect. She didn't think about him much anymore. She'd forgiven herself for not being what he wanted. She'd found something better, a life she'd chosen, a man who saw her clearly, a voice that mattered. Do you ever regret it? Hollis asked quietly. Taking the risk? Going after Voss? No, Nora said. Not for a second. She turned to look at him. Do you? Hollis shook his head. Best decision I ever made was walking into that storm shelter. Found more than I expected. Nora laughed softly. So did I. They sat together as the stars came out, and Nora thought about all the things she'd learned. That courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and choosing to act anyway. That forgiveness started with letting go of the person you thought you had to be. That love wasn't a weakness. It was the thing that made you strong enough to face the hard truths and still believe in something better. She'd been called too soft, too naive, too much like her mother. And maybe she was. But she was also brave. She was also stubborn. She was also enough. The night deepened, and Hollis took her hand. Ready to go inside? In a minute, Nora said. She wanted to hold on to this moment a little longer. The quiet and the warmth and the vast open sky. She wanted to remember that she'd fought for this, that they both had, that it was real, and it was theirs, and nobody could take it away. When they finally went inside, Hollis locked the door and lit the lamp, and Nora sat at her desk to write. Not a story for the paper, but a letter. To herself, maybe. To the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed she wasn't enough. She wrote about the storm shelter, about the stolen papers, about standing in a courtroom and refusing to be silent. She wrote about falling in love with a man the world called dangerous, and discovering he was the safest place she'd ever known. She wrote until her hand cramped, and then she folded the letter and tucked it away. Someday, maybe, she'd show it to someone. Or maybe she'd just keep it, a reminder that she'd survived, that she'd fought, that she'd won. The years that followed were good ones. Blue Creek grew, and the newspaper grew with it. Nora's editorials were reprinted across the territory, and she became known as a voice for reform, for fairness, for the people the system tried to forget. Hollis's business expanded, and he hired men who needed second chances. Men like him who'd been blamed for things they didn't do. Together, they built something solid. They built a home. They had children, 2 daughters with auburn hair and their father's steady eyes. Nora taught them to read before they were 5, and Hollis taught them to ride and to stand their ground. The girls grew up fierce and curious, and Nora watched them with a pride she couldn't put into words. This, she thought, this is what I was fighting for. Not just justice, not just truth, but the chance to build a life where her daughters would never have to prove they were enough. They would just know. On their 10th anniversary, Hollis took Nora back to the storm shelter, where it had all begun. It was still there, weathered and leaning, but standing. They stepped inside, and the space felt smaller than she remembered, but the memory was just as vivid. Nora ran her hand along the rough wall. "I was so scared that day," she said. "So was I," Hollis admitted. "I thought you'd turn me in. Or run. I didn't expect you to stay." "I didn't expect a lot of things," Nora said. "But I'm glad I did." Hollis pulled her close, and she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Me too." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in memory and gratitude. And when they finally left, Nora took one last look back. That shelter had been the start of everything. The place where fear had turned into trust, where two broken people had found the courage to try again. It was just a shed. But it was also a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let yourself hope. The sun was setting as they rode back to town, the sky painted in shades of gold and rose. Nora looked over at Hollis, and he smiled, and she thought about all the miles they'd traveled together, not just across the prairie, but through grief and accusation and doubt. They'd made it. They'd built something good. And that, Nora knew, was worth every risk, every fear, every moment she'd stood up and refused to be silent. Blue Creek thrived in the years that followed, and Nora's newspaper became a fixture, a trusted source that held power accountable and gave voice to those who'd been overlooked. Hollis's hauling business became a cooperative, and the men who worked for him became partners, sharing the profits and the decisions. It was a different kind of West than the one Nora had grown up in, one where people looked out for each other, where second chances were possible, where truth mattered. Nora never forgot the storm that had brought her and Hollis together, or the stolen papers that had changed everything. She kept them in a locked drawer in her desk, a reminder of what they'd risked and what they'd won. And on quiet evenings, when the house was still and the girls were asleep, she'd take them out and read through them, tracing the lines that had led her to this life. The life she'd fought for. The life she'd earned. Years later, when her daughters were grown and starting their own stories, Nora sat on the porch one last time with Hollis beside her, the prairie stretching wide and endless before them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors too beautiful to name, and Nora felt a deep, quiet contentment settle over her. This was enough. This was everything. Hollis took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his. "No regrets?" he asked, his voice soft. "Not one," Nora said. She looked at him, at the man who'd stood beside her through every storm, every fight, every quiet moment of peace. "You?" Hollis shook his head. "Best life I could have asked for." They sat together as the stars came out, and the night settled soft and warm around them. Nora thought about the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed she wasn't enough, the one who'd been so desperate for her father's approval that she'd almost forgotten to live her own life. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman who knew her own worth, who'd fought for what mattered, who'd built a life of purpose and love. And sitting there, with Hollis's hand in hers and the prairies stretching wide before them, Nora knew she'd made the right choices. Every single one. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and sage and possibility. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the sound was lonely and wild and beautiful. Nora closed her eyes and let herself feel it all. The weight of the years, the joy of the journey, the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. When she opened her eyes again, Hollis was watching her, and the love in his gaze was so clear it took her breath away. "I'd do it all again," he said quietly. "Every hard moment, every risk, just to end up here with you." "So would I," Nora said. And she meant it with every fiber of her being. They sat together until the stars filled the sky. And when they finally went inside, Nora felt a peace so deep it was almost sacred. She'd lived a good life. She'd loved and been loved. She'd stood for truth when it would have been easier to stay silent. And she'd built a legacy that would outlast her. A story of courage and hope and second chances. That was enough. That was everything. And as she lay down beside Hollis that night, his arm around her and his breath steady in the darkness, Nora whispered a quiet thank you to the storm that had brought them together, to the stolen papers that had given them a purpose, to the long, hard road that had led them home. And in the morning, the sun rose over Blue Creek, bright and full of promise, and life went on, as it always did, one story after another, one brave choice at a time.